Zelensky has been trying to get a one-on-one meeting with Putin for well over a year, maybe even longer than that. And he's reiterated that here of late. Do you think that Zelensky wants that meeting not to actually engage in some kind of diplomacy like Trump was doing, but either to just make himself an equal with Putin so that he's viewed that way by others, or because he wants to make a grandstanding moment in front of Putin? What do you think his motivations are?
I think there is a strong element of grandstanding about this. I think he wants to put on a show. He wants to show that the Russians take him seriously. He also probably calculates, and to some extent correctly, that if he stages a meeting with Putin and makes his demands and Putin rejects them, then of course it will put, at least in Europe and to some extent in the United States, Zelensky in a stronger position, because it will become even more obvious. It will create the impression that it's Putin who's being obstructive and who is refusing demands. So it's basically theater. But as I said, it also serves a purpose, which is to avoid substantive negotiations. I mean, there is a format for substantive negotiations. There have been 3 meetings between Russian and Ukrainian negotiating teams in Istanbul. Zelensky always refused to do that. He didn't want to send negotiators to meet with Russian negotiators. He doesn't want to deal with the details of the discussion. He certainly doesn't want others to be dealing with the details of the discussions. So he wants to short circuit, to close down that entire process and by replacing it with a purely performative process in which it's just a meeting between Putin and him. It's a way of avoiding negotiations rather than engaging in them.
And let's see if we can figure out why that would be, or what the ultimate objective of doing that, refusing and unwillingness to actually engage in substantive negotiations, because you got to have some sort of an objective that you want to accomplish. And even in a delusional mind, maybe you've got to have some even radical hope that something can turn in your way. And yet there are some big roadblocks. We just mentioned here about the economic issues with the sanctions. 18 sanction package hadn't done anything. There's no reason to think any future ones going to. The secondary tariff issue right there has even more minefields, diplomatic minefields and economic minefields in the global economy. That's unlikely to even be attempted beyond the Indian one. So you've got that issue. Of course, on the battlefield itself, you have the Russian army. It's been on a nonstop offensive really since November 2023, October 2023, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always going forward, et cetera. In the air, we just talked about that. Russia is continuing to step up its capacity in the air. Ukraine simply can't match it. Their air power has been increasingly used on the front line with the Russian Air Force. And then there's the issue of even the theoretical idea of bringing this to an end and having this so-called coalition of the willing that both Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are so excited about, and they've been talking about this for a long time. As Sean Bell talked about on Sky News earlier this week, there's a logistical problem with that too.
What form will they take? Ultimately, they have to be credible and they have to have teeth. One of the challenges that Ukraine faces is they've got at least 1,000 miles of frontline border, even more if you include the border with Belarus. And let's give an idea of the scale required for troops on the ground. If you were to put troops 60 feet apart, which doesn't appear that credible as a deterrence, you'd need 100,000 troops to man the border. Now, you've got to give them a break, so they've got to have 4 months on, 4 months off, and then 4 months training ready for deployment. So you actually need 300,000 troops to be able to man that. Where would these come from? Well, the harsh reality is, even if you use the whole of the UK army, about 30,000 deployable, that's about 10%. There's potential for France to provide another 10%, but it's pretty clear Italy wouldn't provide any. Poland is worried about its own national security, and there's no way that America wants to get itself bogged down in Ukraine. And therefore, where would the rest of these troops come from? It's just not a credible option.
And I want to zero in on that first thing you said there first, that the entirety of the British deployable force is only 30,000. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that some people think that's an overestimate. And we have run down our military to an extraordinary degree in this country. I mean, believe that you've worked with the British military. It has excellent people in it. I have no doubt that British soldiers are as good as you can imagine. But the fact is, it has been running down for years and years and years. And young people in Britain are no longer so keen to serve in the military as they once were. So, I mean, we are very, very short of men. We are very, very short of equipment. I think I told you in an earlier program, and I've had this verified, by the way, that the actual number of usable tanks that the British Army could deploy at any point in time is 40. 40.
Whoa.
40 tanks. I believe the French are in a rather better shape here than we are, but we are not in a good place. So this is a fantasy proposal. I understand that the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has been told this by military people many, many times. I understand that President Macron in France has been told the same thing. And yet, for some incomprehensible reason, this whole topic of sending this reassurance force, as it's sometimes called, or this deployment force or peacekeeping force, simply will not go away. And I think ultimately the probable reason that the Europeans are so keen to send this force to Ukraine and are coming up with this idea time and time again is because they're constantly trying to get what they call the backstop from the Americans, and they're hoping that ultimately, as part of that backstop, the Americans will do that thing which they have consistently said they do not want to do, which is to put boots on the ground, because there is no other possible logic or thinking behind this at all. So this is what this whole plan is. It's about involving the United States directly in this conflict in Ukraine. And I think people in the United States really should understand this.
Now, I think that there's virtually, I guess I can never say 100%, but virtually no chance that even President Trump would even contemplate putting American boots on the ground. He certainly has avidly said the opposite, that he wouldn't do any boots on the ground. He said he might consider some support or air, which I also don't agree with at all. I think he shouldn't do, but no talk about boots on the ground. But even that, though, presupposes that there would be an agreement where the Russians would approve of that. And they have adamantly said throughout this whole thing that they would not do that. So the whole thing, the entire comprehensive ideas that they're pursuing are unattainable. So what is, WTH, man, help me understand what the European mentality is when they are pursuing so many things that are unattainable while the Ukraine people die on a daily basis.
It's difficult to explain or understand, because on the face of it is so completely irrational. I mean, the Europeans trying to get the Americans to do something which I suspect would be politically impossible to do in the United States. But nonetheless, the Europeans still hope some way that could happen, or at least they tell themselves that it can. Now, I think that in the end, deep down, the Europeans don't want the war to end either, at least not in the way that President Trump wants it to end, through a negotiated resolution. They don't want it to end with any kind of concessions to the Russians. I think the political leadership in Europe is so invested in Ukraine and in the whole concept of the war in Ukraine that kind of resolution frankly worries them. And it worries them also, and I've discussed this many times in many places, including, I believe, here on this channel, on this program, that the Europeans always worry that sooner or later the day will come when the Americans and the Russians will come to an understanding about European security, and the Europeans will be left out in the cold. So they don't want that to happen. Rather keep the war going, or better still, win the war in some way. They cannot win the war. They, I think, have come to understand that the United States is not going to fight the war against Russia to win the war, which is a crazy idea anyway. The Ukrainians cannot win the war. So the thing to do is to come up with these proposals all the time, talk about Putin not negotiating, not agreeing to meet Zelensky, set these deadlines, set these ultimatums. And the idea is that the Americans, with their supposedly infinite economic power, will then impose sanctions on the Russians or on Russia's trading partners. And that will finally be the thing that will force the Russians to capitulate and to sit down and talk.
Okay,
and
so
accept the
let's talk
demands.
about that, because you have some knowledge about the Russian economy and how things are running over there. What would be the prospect of that actually working? Let's say that they got it. Let's say that Trump he did put secondary tariffs on China, India, Brazil, maybe even some others on top of that too. What would that do to the Russian economy? Is there enough pressure? Is there some point to where economic pressure can get so great that the president of the Russian Federation would say, all right, boys, y'all come on back home. Let's stop the war and have it on some kind of terms that Europe can live with?
No, it isn't. I mean, it is an illogical idea. I mean, first of all, the thing to say about Russia is that it is an enormous country with enormous resources. I think if by now that wasn't clear, after 3.5 years of war, then people are simply not paying attention. I mean, they've got big industries. By the admission of the NATO Secretary General, they're producing many, many more weapons and arms than we are. And in order to do that, you have to have a lot of industry, which they do have, and you have to have a lot of science and technology, and you've got to have engineers, and they're self-sufficient in energy, and they're self-sufficient in food. It's not an easy country to put under that kind of economic pressure. It's not Iraq, where sanctions really did drain the life out of the economy. And of course, Russia is a big trading economy in itself. It exports to many countries of the world, and other countries depend on its exports. India, as we discussed earlier in the program, buys Russian oil. China wants to buy Russian oil. China is also interested in developing programs with the Russians. The Chinese will not sacrifice their relationship with the Russians simply because we're threatening them with tariffs. If we impose tariffs on China, they will take countermeasures, as they did in the spring. They will deny us rare earths and things of that kind. And yes, we can find workarounds, no doubt. Not easy thing to do, but it's not going to succeed at the core. It's never going to apply enough economic pressure on the Russians to get them to the table, given that for President Putin and a critical mass of people in Russia, I'm sure a large majority, and for the elite as well, the conflict in Ukraine is an existential matter.
And then that leads into I asked you about the economics for the Russian side. Let's get to the military issues for the Russian side. If the Ukraine side stays where it's at, where Zelensky's been, even since Trump has been in office, and the European Union stays where it's at and what it's been talking ever since Trump came into office, they don't move. And then Trump doesn't put his weight behind it anywhere, doesn't compel any changes in the European or Ukraine side. What then is that going to leave for the Russians? Meaning that there's not going to be any concessions. There's not going to be any negotiated settlement that on the terms that Russia can live with. So the only path left to Russia will be the military one. Question is, can they achieve an actual military victory over Ukraine?
Well, I think they can achieve a military victory over Ukraine because they are so much more powerful ultimately than Ukraine is. I don't think, and I've discussed this many times, I don't think ultimately that is their preferred option. They would prefer a negotiated outcome because a military victory over Ukraine is a very problematic concept. And of course, there's the question of where does the Russian army stop? How many losses does it have to incur to get there? And what, after the fighting ends, does the future hold? I mean, let's say they battle through to the Dnieper, which I think they can, and I think they probably would, within a fair approximate measure of time. And what then? What if they achieve the outcome they want, and the the Zelensky government in Kiev collapses and a new government is installed which signs some kind of a peace deal with the Russians. That is the optimal outcome of the war from a Russian point of view, if we're talking about military solutions. What if many people in Ukraine won't accept it? What if many people in the West won't accept it? What if Western governments won't accept it? What if it results in long-term complications between Russia and the United States? It's not the outcome the Russians would prefer. That's why they are seeking a deal. But if they cannot get that deal, if it is permanently off the table, given that for them it is an existential issue, then they will continue the war until the kind of outcome that I set out is achieved. And I don't think anybody should be in any doubt about this. And of course, if a Russian military victory has problems for them, it has far bigger problems for us. Firstly, we will be seen to have lost. And secondly, if we're talking about the United States, and I get the sense that the United States has many interests in other places, and the president wants to focus on the United States as well. If there is a Russian military victory, then the pressure to maintain a strong, powerful American presence in Europe is going to be very, very much greater. And that is not, I think, what the president or his officials would like to see.
Man, one has to hope, but I just almost fear that just we can't think beyond the end of our nose, and that goes for the entire West. That we're just looking to get to the next week. We don't think about where this can go on the like 2 phases down the road for this, which it seems to me that the Russians are thinking 3 or 4 phases down the road. And they certainly seem to have calculated that into their capacities and their industrial capacity, their manpower creation capacity, their economic capacity. They seem to be thinking all these, way down the road where we're not thinking beyond the 19th sanctions package, apparently. So that's not really encouraging there. But I mean, I can't see any outcome that leads any different, because right now, I think I can safely categorically say the peace process that President Trump started when he came into office is dead. There's no more room for it. I think everything that could have been done has been done. The meetings have happened. The proposals have been exchanged, and we're now further away. How do you see it any differently?
I'm afraid you've never said a truer word, and you say so many. But this is absolutely right. I mean, what you said about the fact that we plan from day to day. We're in the Europe. What we're trying to do all the time, we're spending an enormous amount of energy trying to keep President Trump from having discussions with President Putin and coming to agreements with him. I mean, it's quite awful, actually. We won't talk to the Russians ourselves. What we're trying to do is to stop President Trump talking to the Russians. It is an absurd situation, but you're absolutely right. We're living from day to day. And of course, when people do that, ultimately it ends badly. It always does. In any area of life, you have to some extent at least try to plan ahead. The Russians are doing that. I mean, that is partly a structural thing. I mean, that's how Russia works to a great extent. I mean, they were people who have always tended to plan, but they do plan. They plan the war. They plan their economy, the way their economy should be run. They plan how to build up their foreign relations. They're meeting in Tianjin in China. Tomorrow, their president is meeting the president of China and the prime minister of India, 2 of the most powerful people in the world. So you can see that they are planning. We are not. And in any conflict type situation that I know of, I'm sure this is true. Of course, it's true in war. I've no doubt it's true in war, but it's also true in litigation. It's true in business, in anything. Those who plan tend to win. Those who don't and make it up as they're going along tend to lose. But that's exactly where we are, as you so rightly said.
So kind of as a wrap up here, I think that we can say, at least on the surface, that what the entire West writ large is doing is just detached from reality. It's unrealistic. It certainly is not going to accomplish anything good. Probably is going to lose in every realm you want to have. The one possibility that there is some thought that is longer term gets into a little bit darker of a territory, and I'd like your view on the viability of this. One of the other possibilities or interpretations is that the European leaders are well aware of all these things we mentioned. They know that they're going to lose this conflict. It's already lost, and they're actually playing for what comes next, which is creation of some sort of new Cold War where Russia can be seen as this, modern day Hitler, where, oh my God, they just took Ukraine. We're next if we don't up arm really big, really fast. And so that gives more impetus to higher defense budgets, faster ramping up from what's even currently envisioned here, because they want to have this situation where there's basically a new Cold War. Is
Absolutely.
that plausible?
I think it's entirely plausible, and I don't think it is that far under the surface. I'm sure that there are people in Europe who'd say this and who are discussing this. And of course, the point is, again, keeping the Americans in Europe. This is always the ultimate obsession, because to discuss this, and Professor Mearsheimer and I have talked about this with each other many times. You can see the programs we do with Glenn Deason. The Europeans need, or believe they need, the Americans to stay, not just because the Americans keep the Russians at bay, but because the Americans have been so instrumental in Europe over the last 80 years in preserving peace. We have had a long history of conflicts with each other. Those conflicts, people worry, would resume if the Americans, the American pacifiers, were to leave. So you keep the Americans in Europe by creating this specter of the Russians and telling the Americans, if you don't stay in Europe, the Russians will take it over, and that will be a disaster for you. There's that famous quip by Lord Ismay, who was the first Secretary General of NATO, a British official, and he said that the entire purpose of NATO is threefold. It's to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans
in. Yeah. Right. And that whole thing rests on a profoundly illogical fact, or maybe a powerful omission, is because the idea, because without the American backstop, the Russians could come rolling in, or maybe we could splinter, etc. This ain't 1938 anymore. In 1938, Hitler had a force that could do a lot of this stuff, but there was no nuclear weapons on the Western side that could provide a roadblock for them. Right now, you can't go rolling in with a NATO army into Russia. You can't go in with the Russian army rolling into NATO, because both sides have nuclear weapons that will deter the other. No one's going to do that. So this is not 1938, and the Russians aren't going to roll an army across, because you have Britain and France, your own nuclear weapons, which Russia is well aware of, and they don't want to commit suicide and draw nuclear weapons on themselves. So they're not going to do this. And that simple foundational reality is like ignored, or I don't know. It baffles me, I got to say.
You're completely correct. I mean, it's an absurd idea. I mean, it's not 1938, and it's not even 1946, when Stalin had vast armies on the Oder, which he could, at least in theory, move westward. Not that, though it seems that he never did, in fact, plan to do that. But I mean, at least in 1946, you could tell yourself that that was a real danger. So you needed the Americans there, because the British and the French in those days did not have nuclear weapons. Now they do. Now, the Russia of today is not the Soviet Union of 1946. Right. I mean, it is an absurd idea. It's nonsensical, in fact. But of course, it is the scarecrow that is always raised up, and it's done partly in order to frighten the people of Europe themselves, partly so that they can increase defense spending and do all of those things, and continue to support this increasingly unpopular project of European integration, which is a huge topic, which we can discuss on a different program. But also, and first and foremost, keep the Americans in. Keep the Americans in Europe, because without them, we are in a world that we cannot imagine and are very afraid of, and just don't know where it will go.
Yeah, I'd like you to find out. I want you to try to find and work out with that world and make it happen. Let's be friends, but you don't need us in there. I mean,
no, it would be a better place. We would then start taking responsibility for our own decisions. It would be a better place in Europe. Britain, France, Germany would be viable and independent countries. We would not have ridiculous situations like all those European leaders going to the Oval Office and cowering in front of the President of the United States, which is shameful. And it would be a better place for the United States too, which doesn't want, I think this is true, doesn't ultimately want to be in this situation where it is taking responsibility for Europe all the time and is tied down to it constantly in the way that it is. So I think that all of these fears, including the fears that the Europeans undoubtedly do have of each other, are groundless. It's something we should embrace, not run away from. Indeed. But I'm afraid there are very, very few people in power in Europe who think in that way.
Very few. There's a couple, but they don't have much influence. But anyway, but all we can do is to illuminate the truth and the reality and show that there is a path. There is a path to end the war. There is a path to bring stability to the European continent and economic vitality for everybody. That's on the table, and it's possible if only our leaders would accept it. But there it is. We have it. But listen, appreciate you coming on. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Invite everybody to go to Alexander Mercouris on his Duran show. And also when you're on with your other buddy, Alex, there on those shows. Yeah, so that's a lot of good stuff there. Anything coming up new? Anything on the show that you want to highlight?
Oh no! I mean, at the moment, I mean, we churn out programs all the time. But I think one thing that is coming, obviously, we're going to look at this whole BRICS meeting, rather Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that's happening in China, and we'll be discussing the issues between India and the United States in a lot more detail. And of course, there's also a lot of concerns about the situation in the Middle East, about Iran. There's been a decision to reimpose sanctions on Iran, snapback sanctions. That's obviously an important topic, and we'll be talking about that as well. But you know, we're there every day. We're churning out things every day. Go to us, and we will undoubtedly educate you, as I get educated when I come on this program. and vice versa, I assure you. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.